Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network. And welcome back, everybody. I believe we all have a story. And when you hear others' stories, it inspires you, makes you learn certain things, maybe makes you or helps you realize certain things in your life. He has shared many stories about his past, and that also includes his scientific past and how so many different experiments and social phenomena that he's discovered in his career in the science arena, but also his family and how he got to be at this point and also have a wonderful memoir. He's our professional of the year, and he's the man behind Art Molecular Concepts, LLC. Grant Venerable is back with us. Hi, Grant. How you doing?
Fine, Stephen. How are you doing?
Very well, very well. And I'm glad we're back here. We learned so much about the polling process during the elections with an eye on science. You enlightened many of us over a couple of weeks during that political journey. And here we are looking at your background. We never got deep into your father and his Caltech connection, but trailblazing situation way back in the day. Can we talk about that? Yes,
indeed. That goes into another facet of my book, my memoir, called Footprints in the Chaotic Unknown. But it also goes to what our listeners can also look up online. If they would Google Caltech and Venerable House at Caltech. Venerable House was built, but with a different name, in 1960. And it was named after the chairman of the board of trustees at Caltech, who was a very fine gentleman. He was a champion of the eugenics cause, and Caltech was closely associated with the corporate CEOs in Southern California, many of whom were followers of the eugenics philosophy of life, which was a philosophy that looked on how do we purify the people of any country, but in this case, the United States. How do we root out the misfits that don't fit, those that might drag the society down? How do we enhance the production of the intelligent, the geniuses of the society? And that was the background of how Caltech happened to be championed as a new kind of a university in Southern California that would champion the production of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant elite of the United States. And there was a feeling on the part of the elite that we had to move into a new place. That is, that group had to find a new home. And that was Southern California. And the immigrants of European heritage in Southern California were primarily of background in the United Kingdom and of Northern Europe, Germany, the Scandinavian countries. And Caltech was founded by people on the trustee board to get away from the drag of other kinds of people who predominantly inhabited the East Coast, all of the Ivy Leagues out there. So they wanted to get more away from Southern Europeans, Eastern Europeans, and other people from other continents, and build an institution that had a pure Anglo-Saxon orientation. It's paradoxical that Caltech was built against that background because it all changed. That whole purpose fell apart in the 1930s, right after the Human Betterment Foundation was founded on the Caltech campus. It was founded in 1929, the same year my father was admitted for study in engineering and science. Well, one might wonder, well, how could that be? This young colored man, as they would put it in those days, how in the heck did he get in the first place if there had been this emphasis toward the Anglo-Saxon Protestant peoples? There weren't really any Jews in that purpose. It was just this elite group. But that changed. It started to change in the early 1930s when the president of Caltech at that time, Robert Millikan, who was describable as a white nationalist, but not in the way that word is bandied around today. In other words, he preferred to have people of high European heritage be the professors at that institution and be great in their fields of science, mathematics, and engineering. So how in the heck did they admit this fellow, Grant Venerable, who had recently attended UCLA and done very well in mathematics, but he did something that got the chairman of the department upset with him, and so he was punished in a way by getting kicked out. And that made my father say, well, I'm not getting this right. I've got to get life right. How do I not break the rules and get right? So he made up his mind. Where did he really want to go to finish a bachelor's degree? And he said he wanted to go to Caltech to himself. But he never uttered that to anyone outside of his immediate family because he rather wisely decided that others like him would say, oh, that's crazy. You can't get in there. And if you did, you couldn't get through there because they won't let you through out of racial reasons. But so he kept it quiet. He got in. He passed the entrance exam. They didn't have SATs back then. Each prominent prestige school wrote its own entrance exam, as Caltech did, in math and physics. And he didn't do that well in physics and chemistry, but he really did brilliantly on the mathematics, which maybe he should have, because he had already been a math major in UCLA, probably the only math major, or one of two, of color, of African heritage, west of the Mississippi River. But he was darn good in math. And Caltech said, well, you'll learn the physics because you know the math so well. The admissions people told him that. And he got in. He did well. And the only way to get through a school like that, of such prestige, and as challenging as a Caltech or an Ivy League school or a UC Berkeley, is that you had to get along. You had to know how to get along, first with your classmates and with your professors and with your deans. And that is exactly what he did. Well, the next question was, how did he do that? Where did he come from? What kind of background did he come out of to be able to do that? And anyway, why didn't he go to a historically black college? Well, he wanted to go to Caltech. That's why. So he made up his mind. Now, that's some determination that did that. But his background gives some clues as to how he could master a place like Caltech. That's where he would go on weekends, where his grandma and his step-grandpa lived in Odessa, Missouri. That had been slave country back during slavery. In fact, my father, Grant Venerable's great-grandmother, his grandmother was owned by a couple, a Confederate colonel and his wife, who lived in Odessa, Missouri. That in itself was an astounding situation. He would go to Odessa from Kansas City where his parents lived and spend weekends with his grandmother and his step-grandfather. Well, he was about like 5 to 8 years old when he was a playmate with other of his cousins who lived there in the vicinity of the house that he was raised in. But he was also a playmate of the colonel, the grandchildren of the colonel and his wife, Susan Gibbs Elliott. The colonel was Colonel Elliott, Benjamin Elliott. Very unusual situation. The Elliots owned perhaps 4 servants. They never referred to them as their slaves. They called them the servants. When they had harder labor to do, they would hire some Negro people, black people who lived in the neighborhood, and bring them in to chop wood or do more difficult things. And so that they got used. My father got used to playing with children of both white and black backgrounds, and they all. I think that was a large influence on him. He never developed the antipathies that others in slavery had developed against their white slave owners. I didn't look at that for a long time, but as I got into my father's genealogy, I began to understand a lot about what life was like and what it was not like. He did graduate from Caltech in 1932, long time ago. He went from there into all of the graduates in that class, walked out of the doors of Caltech and tried to find jobs, but none were to be had because it was the Great Depression. And it took several years for a number of the classmates in the class of 32 and 33 to get jobs. My father was unable to get a regular job. There was racial prejudice going along, but he was befriended by classmates and others from Caltech who got him positions in various fields related to civil engineering, which was his specialty. So he was able to get some engineering done there in mining, in surveying, and other things related. And he did get a regular full-time job in the insurance industry. Well, there was an African-American insurance company called Golden State. It was founded in the 1920s. And they hired him, even though he didn't have training in business administration. They said, well, he's just darn smart. Anyone who graduated from Caltech would be very helpful to us. And he became a superintendent, a salesman. That's where he learned how really to get along with people, with colleagues, with people in the community. And then with his brother-in-law, he went on and bought a hotel, ran that for a few years, and then they went into their own business making blackboard erasers. That's what you use, felt erasers, to erase the blackboards in schools, and he did that for the rest of his life. And that's how he was able to support his children. Well, there were many adventures at Caltech. One was, because he went to Caltech, I wanted to go where my father went, and I applied. I applied to the Ivy League schools. Well, America was really going through some changes back then in the late 1950s, the 1960s, and I didn't get admitted to any place I applied to, even though I had a very excellent grade point average. But by then they had SATs, and they believed a great deal in the SATs. Now, if I'd had scores of 1,400 or something like that to 1,600 on my verbal and my math, I probably would have gotten into Harvard or Caltech, but I didn't. But I could get into UCLA with a lower score of 1,200, which was a darn good score, I found out later. And that's where I found my academic redemption, in chemistry. And UCLA gave me the intellectual strength to go on to graduate school to win my Doctor of Philosophy degree in physical chemistry, very related to physics, chemical physics. So that's the background here of that. But the question behind it is, how do you get from a background in African American slavery to that kind of level in higher education that my father got to, that I got to, that my sister got to, that my brother got to in their fields? So with that, I think there's a few things we could talk about here, Stephen.
Absolutely. And what the tenacity that your father had to keep going forward. You know, there could have been a mountain in front of him. It seemed like he wasn't taking no for an answer. I'm going to get this done. I don't care. Do you feel that was his mentality, and have you adopted that yourself?
I didn't even notice I was adopting it. It was just the way you had to be. And that's the way he was. He had a lot of hurdles, barriers thrown down in his path, but he just ignored them and kept going. He found other ways around the obstacles. He never had time for feeling sorry for himself or being upset with conditions that faced other people of his ancestry who also came into Southern California from backgrounds in the Deep South. So that is true. That's true. And so I never developed any hesitations about what I wanted to do, which was in science. And I built up enough so I got into probably one of the 5 most prestigious schools in the 1960s to go to graduate school, and that was the University of Chicago, which is where the Manhattan Project was done. That's where the atomic bomb was developed. So my professors there many of them had worked on the Manhattan Project. They had studied with the great professors who had congregated from the Berkeley, from the West Coast, Berkeley, Stanford, from the East Coast, Princeton, Harvard, MIT, to build this terrible, terrible weapon, which they felt they had to do to protect ourselves from the Nazi regime in Germany, which was also building a bomb. So it was a real race. So that's my background, was being trained to be an experimentalist, which is my approach to life. Everything becomes an experiment, and I collect data from observations. I develop hypotheses about whatever it is, like with the polling on the elections, leading up to the elections. I developed hypotheses and then watched the data come in to see if I was right. And I was right. The news media didn't really know very much, and the polls didn't help them much because the results were not what they expected based on their polling. And I understand why that was, but they left out one factor, and that's the timing of when they would take the polls. If they had looked at timing the way chemists follow chemical reactions, what atoms and molecules react at what points in time, the news media would not have been left dumbfounded. How did that happen? How did this outcome occur? Well, in the long run, it may turn out to be the right outcome, but it's going to challenge the whole country to help make it that way. So that's where we are today.
Amazing. What's your takeaway? What did your dad tell you that stuck in your mind all these years?
One thing is to follow up on ideas, and he would goad me, inveigle me, and we would go into churches for recitals with some of the greatest organs in the world in Los Angeles. And I would look at all of the Gothic arches and the stained glass windows, and he would whisper at me. He said, "You think you could take your American bricks and make a model of this church or this cathedral?" And I was just, And within the week, I had made a model using American bricks. But he knew how to get me seated, get me inspired, and so that I began to do that on my own. And one of the things was to do the projects I wanted to do. I set up a solar cell on the roof of our family home to collect sunlight, to make an electric current that I would run through a wire to my bedroom and put the wire's endings in a glass of water to watch the photochemical reaction while it was creating chlorine gas, oxygen gas, and whatever was in that water. But that's the field I wound up in, was electrochemistry, done not with electricity with wires, but actually with radiation pulses of electrons producing products that you couldn't get in another way with very high energies.
And Grant, so, what age were you when you were messing around with those solar cells?
I started when I was about 15 years of age. That's also when I got the thought, I want to build a rocket. Kids are real interested in rockets. I never really got that off the ground, and when I became an adult, I was grateful I didn't. My dad did not just try to discourage me.
I can relate to all of this, and I'm just sharing in 15 seconds that I wanted to be on the radio so bad that, and again, when I was younger, I'm talking, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, there was a transistor radio stuck to my ear 24/7. All the time. I wanted it so bad, and I can relate to, you with the solar cells back then. I taught myself electronics. I taught myself how to make a PC board. I built my own mixer, and I had one turntable I would have to borrow without permission sometimes, my twin sister's turntable, so I can mix together music on a cassette. And somebody took that cassette out of my jacket and submitted it to a radio station, somebody that I was connected to that was working there part-time. And that's how I had no confidence. That's how I got my first job at 17.
Wow.
Taught myself.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And you know what's so funny, Grant? I just got to share because I'm smiling at your story. In this studio, which is in an office building, not my home, that, I took over here, every wire in this room, I wired myself. Even the equipment, some of it, I worked on myself to make it more custom for my application. I did it all myself. And it's funny when I look around here, I'm doing the same thing I did when I was 11. It's the same exact thing. But
that's so often the case.
Right?
But anyway, my father got his attitudes from his grandparents and great-grandparents when they were in bondage. These people were free, relatively free in bondage because their minds were free.
He seems like he left you with a lot. He left you with a lot, didn't he?
He did.
Yeah.
Don't let obstacles, don't let words get to you. Just let insults slide down your shoulders and don't pick them up.
Yeah.
And that was a major, major lesson because, there were many words. Even after I started teaching in college.
Sure.
And
but those stood with you. Let things roll off your shoulder, which, my takeaway, my dad wasn't I wasn't super close with him, but I remember 3 things. Breathe, and now I do, intentionally. Learn how to read, and learn how to dance. And that was those are three things that really, really stood out for me. Yeah. It's amazing when you think back. Grant, wonderful always talking with you.
Yeah.
I feel like I'm with you on your journey based on the way you tell stories and the detail and the visuals. I feel like I know your father. It's kind of weirdly interesting.
He's a remarkable guy.
Yeah, sounds so, very much so. Grant, your memoir, how do we find out more about that if somebody wants to take a look at that?
Go on a search engine online, Footprints in the Chaotic Unknown by Grant Venerable. It all pops up there on Amazon's, Apple's, Barnes & Noble websites. And they can order ebooks because they're in ebook form right now.
Sure. Thank you so much for being here today and the inspiration and the positivity. Very much appreciate it.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll be right back. Broadcasting from the business capital of the world, this is the Podcast Business News Network.
Not completing high school is more of a social thing than it was an academic thing. I came out in the 11th grade. Nobody was embracing you. The kids were cruel. It was very difficult to be gay. Even though all these years have passed, I still had that longing to have my diploma.
The hard part was determining that I was going to do it, but I definitely didn't do it alone.
At age 30, with the help of her mentor, Carissa finished her high school diploma.
I have a mentor, Maria. She convinced me to continue my education and to finish what I started to get my diploma. Just never judges. She's a true role model. If you're even considering getting your high school diploma, go get it. You can do it.
No one gets a diploma alone. If you're thinking of finishing your high school diploma, you have help. Find free adult education classes near you at finishyourdiploma.org. That's finishyourdiploma.org. Brought to you by the Dollar General Literacy Foundation and the Ad Council.